Ladies and gentlemen, if I'll have your attention here, please. Welcome to the historic estate of Colonel Robert R. McCormick, who served with the 1st Infantry Division during World War I and is our continuing benefactor and why we have all this here today. Today you're going to have to suffer and just settle with me. Unfortunately, our executive director, Paul Herbert, has some family issues that he's had to deal with, and so he's unable to be with us here tonight. But my name is J.D. Kamas. I'm the Public Programs Manager, and you guys will have to suffer through me for tonight. So, tonight I'd like to introduce David Galantz. David Galantz received his degree in history from the Virginia Military Institute and the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, and is a graduate of U.S. Army Command and General Staff College, Defense Language Institute, Institute for Russian and Eastern European Studies, and the U.S. Army War College. He entered active service with the United States Army in 1963 as a field artillery officer. He served in various assignments in the United States and in Vietnam during the Vietnam War. He taught history at the United States Military Academy at West Point. He worked at U.S. Army Europe's Office of the Deputy Chief of Staff for Intelligence. He became Chief of Research at the Army's newly formed Combat Studies Institute at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas, and then Director of Soviet Army Operations at the Center for Land Warfare at the U.S. Army War College in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. He helped found and later directed the U.S. Army's Foreign Military Studies Office and retired at the rank of colonel. He established the Journal of Slavic Military Studies, which covers military affairs in the states of Central and Eastern Europe, as well as the former Soviet Union. As a member of the Russian Federation's Academy of Natural Sciences, he has written or co-authored more than 20 commercially published books, over 60 self-published studies and atlases, and over 100 articles dealing with the history of the Red Soviet Army, Soviet military strategy, operational art and tactics, and numerous other things about the Soviet military, especially during World War II. In recognition of his work, he has received several awards, including the Society for Military History's prestigious Samuel Eliot Morrison Prize for his contributions to the study of military history, and he lives with his wife Mary in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. Tonight's book is called The Battle of Kursk and is all about the Battle of Kursk during World War II. Please welcome David Galantz.
Thank you very much. How does this sound back there in the rear? Can you hear me? Okay, I'm never quite sure how far it's going to carry. They've told me to stay pretty close to this podium between here and here because that's where the camera range is on however they're photographing this thing. And these days, technology kind of rules, so I'm going to not wander like I usually do, but I'm going to stand here and try to discipline myself to behave and not wander too much. What I'm going to talk about tonight is the Battle of Kursk. I've come to entitle all my presentations dealing with the Soviet-German War as myths and realities, and I do so for a very good reason. In the past 20 years, probably since 1991, with a tremendous release of archival materials from the Soviet Union and the Russian Federation thereafter, and a fresh mining of archival materials from the German archives, we have really begun fundamentally reassessing the nature of that titanic conflict that stands astride World War II, the Soviet-German War, the largest of the ground war theaters in World War II, and certainly an effort that stands side by side with the U.S. Army's efforts, the U.S. Navy's efforts, the Marine Corps' efforts in the Pacific, the war against Japan, and the final campaigns of Europe. These are all comparable scale operations, and they all had a momentous impact on the ultimate outcome of the war. What I'm going to do with Kursk today is try to put it in a bit of context. I spent my last 5 years looking at Operation Barbarossa, the first German campaign in the East, and Operation Blau, the Stalingrad campaign, the second major German operation in the East. As a matter of fact, I've been a captive of Stalingrad for better than 5 years. And my appearance here today comes on the heels of a 5-month sequester, locking myself in my house literally with my wife as a protector, telling people to go away so that I could finally finish the third volume of my Stalingrad series. So I'm celebrating my release tonight, in a sense. Although I will tell you there's going to be a fourth volume, but you can't call a trilogy a fourth volume, so it's going to be supplemental. In any case, it's very important to understand Kursk in context to what transpired during the first 2 years of the war. And those first 2 years of fighting have been woefully misunderstood in past histories. We've misunderstood them for a variety of reasons, and I'll touch upon some of those as I go through today's night's presentation. Now, I always have about 3 times as much material as I can cover. That's why you can't do my presentations in PowerPoint. I edit as I go, and I'm never sure what I'm going to cover and what I'm not. What I am going to do is cover the high points and then stop wherever you want me to stop and answer whatever questions you have for me to answer, so that you don't hold them and then forget them by the time we're through at the end. Hopefully we'll be able to cover everything involved in the Kursk campaign in this period of about an hour and a half. What I've shown up in the slide there is what I entitle the traditional view of Kursk. I'm not sure if you can read it, but it's a pretty simple graphic. This is the view of Kursk that has predominated since 1945 and war's end. That the Battle of Kursk itself was a battle of about a week's duration. It was the culmination of German blitzkrieg tactics writ large against a well-prepared, deep Soviet defense in which panzers ground themselves into the dust against panzers, against anti-tank weapons and artillery. And that it was a battle which involved a German maneuver attack, a frontal attack, a maneuver offense, the classic blitzkrieg-type offense with panzer divisions. And it involved an elaborate Soviet positional defense, a defense designed to wear down and blunt the spearheads of those German armored forces. The culminating point, according to most histories, has been on the field of Prokhorovka, a railhead town south of Kursk, a town where the Soviet Central Front had its headquarters, a town where 2nd SS Panzer Corps reached the approaches to, and where a final titanic battle took place between roughly 1,200 and 1,500 tanks that settled once and for all the overall Battle of Kursk. All of those things are wrong, and I'll point out why as we go through today's presentation. The assumptions that these historians have used was that the German offensive, conducted in July instead of May when it was supposed to, failed because it was conducted too late. That is patently wrong, as I think I'll show for you. The Soviets were completely forewarned about the offensive. Yes, the Soviets had received Ultra intercepts from Britain. The last Ultra materials were sent to them at the end of April, after which a very alarmed Churchill, who didn't want the Soviets to win too quickly, simply turned the spigot off. They knew, the Soviets know where the attack was going to come. They didn't know precisely when, and they didn't know precisely where. They just knew it would be the Kursk Bulge. That's the degree of forewarning they had. Most historians have assumed that the German defeat was either inevitable or the offensive was halted prematurely. And the bulk of German historians, and many of the veterans, in particular the Panzer veterans, were very, very upset because after the Battle of Prokhorovka, which the Germans claimed they won, they should have gone on. And if they'd gone on, they would have won. I think we'll pretty much show that that, too, is a false assumption. That the subsequent Soviet offensives that, oh, by the way, began the very day the Battle of Prokhorovka began, the 12th of July, 1943, offensives against the Oryol salient to the north, involving over 1 million Soviet troops, that was an accident, according to historians, simply the Soviets taking advantage of their success in slowing the Germans at Kursk. We now know that it was not an accident that had been planned 2 to 3 months before, and it was supposed to be launched the moment the Germans were halted, just as it was. And perhaps the final of all the myths, at Prokhorovka, 800 Soviet tanks fought 700 German tanks to a standstill, with losses of roughly 400 and 300 tanks on each side. We'll see that the actual battle at Prokhorovka was substantially smaller than that number you see up there. Now, a few words about what transpired in years before. This is a very simple slide that shows you graphically the scope of Operation Barbarossa, begun on 22 June 1941 by surprise, a surprise attack that caught the Soviet Air Force on the ground, that caught the Soviets unprepared, in most cases to deal with a German invasion, and an invasion that, because of those factors, turned out to be immensely successful at first. You can watch the blue arrows spread eastward across the Soviet Union to a depth of 1,000 kilometers, to the gates of Moscow in the west, east, the gates of Leningrad in the north, the gates of Rostov in the south, only to recede suddenly in November and December 1941 with German defeat at a point where the Germans should have been absolutely victorious. The question has long been asked, why did Barbarossa fail? Why did the Germans fail? We now know the answer to that. The answer to that was that although bloodily bad, the Soviets resisted from the very beginning and ordered from Moscow counterattack after counterattack after counterattack. Many of them utterly senseless, many of them aimless, most of them costly, but all of them having a tremendous cumulative effect on the Wehrmacht, to the extent that the Wehrmacht that reached Moscow on 5 December and reached St. Petersburg or Leningrad on early September and Rostov in mid-November 1941 were not the Wehrmacht units that had begun the invasion in June. They were far less capable, and that attrition largely explains why what happened to the Germans in December actually happened, why a desperate Soviet counterattack at Moscow suddenly succeeded and was expanded into a counterstroke within a week and then into a counteroffensive within 3 weeks, and the army had to fight for its life in December 41 and January 42. If you look at Operation Blau the next year, you'll see the same thing. This time, a German invasion conducted across a very narrower front, just the southern Soviet Union. You can see the arrows spreading eastward from the Kursk area and the Kharkov area in the Donbass region. This is also an operation that historically in the German memoirs have described as a fairly easy operation, a cakewalk for the Germans, without heavy fighting, a cakewalk that carried them all the way to the Volga River at Stalingrad and into the Caucasus regions to the high Caucasus Mountains in the south. But once again, what history has not told us is the amount of fighting that occurred during Operation Blau. A tremendous amount of fighting, once again ordered by the Stavka and Stalin in Moscow, sending new tank armies into operation, sending new armies in, telling old armies to stand and fight and die where you are. This was a very difficult advance for the Germans, an advance that brought them to the city streets of Stalingrad by October 42, with most German divisions by that time at somewhere in the neighborhood of 45 to 50% of their original strength. And the Panzer divisions that had fielded 100 to 160 tanks on the 28th of June 1942, by October 42 down to 10 and 15 tanks if they were lucky in the first place. And a German army which by the end of October 42 finds itself operating on a front that is 3 or 4 times as wide as it should have been operating on given the numbers, to the extent that finally the Germans have no choice but to throw Allied armies into the front, 2 Romanian armies, a Hungarian army, and an Italian army, kind of an ersatz made-up army group, when in fact these forces are not capable of defending what an army group would be able to defend. And of course the consequences in 1942 are even more catastrophic for the Germans than they were in 1941. They didn't lose armies or even divisions in 1941. In 1942, when the Soviets strike back in November and then expand the offensive throughout the winter, you see entire German armies wiped off the map, beginning with Paulus's 6th Army, numbering somewhere in the neighborhood of 300,000 men, disappear from the German order of battle. The 4th Panzer Army, 150,000 men, disappears from the German order of battle. The 3rd and 4th Romanian armies, with 200,000 men each, disappear from the Axis order of battle. And within another month, the Italian 8th Army disappears from the Axis order of battle, followed by the Hungarian Second Army in January 1943, followed by the better part of German Second Army. That's over 1 million men lost between November 19th, 1942 and the 1st of February 1943, and it's something that the Wehrmacht and the Axis are hard-pressed to replace. This provides context for Kursk. Now, what happened after the winter campaign of 42 and 43, most of you know. Most of you know the Germans were lucky enough to extract their army group out of the Caucasus region in the far south and bring back their 1st Panzer Army and 17th Army before they were cut off, and they were very close to being cut off and lost before being brought back. And Field Marshal von Manstein, sent down to head Army Group Don, was able to take those forces and orchestrate very skillfully a counteroffensive. People have called it a counterstroke. I call it a counteroffensive because it had strategic implications. It halted a Soviet drive, which the Soviets intended to carry much more distant to the west, and it perhaps even postponed a German collapse in the east for the number of years it ultimately did. Now, the Manstein's counteroffensive in the Donbass region and at Kharkov left as a legacy this. This is the Kursk Bulge. History up to about 5 years ago ignored the question, where'd that Kursk Bulge come from in the first place? Because in the post-Stalingrad period, no Soviet force advanced in that direction. The Soviet forces went down here. We now know that once 6th Army surrendered in Stalingrad on the 2nd of February, that released 7 armies to the Stavka, or the Soviet High Command. And they took 3 of these armies, plus 3 more they'd raised, won an entire army of NKVD, the 70th Army, and they put them under the command of General Rokossovsky, who had eliminated and liquidated 6th Army at Stalingrad, and they told him to split the German front, reach the Desna River, reach the Dnieper if you can, and in concert with what was going down here, collapse the German front. And that offensive kicked off in early February. It had a full tank army in it. The weather was bad. It drove a huge wedge between 2 German armies, 2nd Panzer and the 2nd, and it came pretty darn close to fulfilling its mission of splitting the entire Eastern Front. One of the miracles of that winter, in addition to Manstein's counteroffensive down here to restore the front, was the ability of the Germans to close this gap and create, by doing so, create the Kursk Bulge. Now, one of the German mythologies, one of the myths associated with the war is that if only Manstein had been allowed to continue after winning his victories in the Donbass and Kharkov, if in March he'd been allowed to continue his march, they really don't say where because it's very hard to decide where he would have gone, that he could in fact have taken advantage of Soviet weakness. The Soviets had admittedly allowed themselves to become overextended during the winter campaign. The missions they assigned their armies were overly optimistic. They hoped to do nothing less than collapse the whole German front. And so they gambled. And they lost that gamble up against Manstein. But having said that, if you look at the condition of German forces in this area in the end of March, and you look at the condition of the Panzer units and the infantry units, you'll realize what a slender reed it would have been for those units to attempt to do more. In fact, if you look at this period, you will find, and this map has it on there, these are all, and you can't see them very well because they don't come out too well on this camera, but these are armies, separate armies encircled. This is the 62nd, the famous 62nd Army of Stalingrad fame, Chuikov's army, which will be shortly renamed 8th Guards. This is the 64th, to be renamed 7th Guards. There are more armies here. There's 2 more in Stalingrad. All of these forces were uncommitted and ready to engage the Germans had they attempted to further exploit their victories in February and March. So basically what I'm saying is that the Germans would have been very hard-pressed to go anywhere and do anything without essentially risking everything that Manstein had gained in his carefully orchestrated counter-offensive in the Donbass region. Well, this leaves us with 2 questions. For the Germans, the question is, And most German generals would admit this, and most German officers, I've talked to many of them, would admit this. By the time Stalingrad was over, the handwriting was on the wall. Germany knew they were going to lose the war. The question was, how badly would they lose it? A year before, the defeat at Moscow had proven that Germany would not win the war on Hitler's terms, the Barbarossa terms. That was clear. And November 42 settled the issue of would they win it on anybody's terms? And the answer was clearly no. Therefore, the Germans, with Hitler's assent, because Hitler was always more optimistic than his generals, decided to resume offensive operations in the summer of 43, only in a much more limited sector and with a much more limited aim. This is a very simple graphic. I'll show you some of the actual plans themselves just in passing. But essentially, the German aim was to abandon this salient up here. That's the famous Rzhev salient occupied by German 9th Army. Move General Model's 9th Army down to the south and launch an attack from the north and the south against this Kursk bulge. Why the Kursk bulge? Bulges are ideal targets. Bulges are ideal targets for envelopment. And the Soviets knew that. And when they took this Kursk bulge, they didn't withdraw from it. They instead kept it and decided to use it as bait. And they stuffed into that bulge two full fronts, army groups by our parlance, the Central Front and the Voronezh Front, each with 3 armies. And they told those two fronts to dig in not only with infantry and artillery and anti-tank, but to dig in with armor as well. And we know full well if we do this, the Germans will attack it. Now, while the Germans were debating what to do, and I will say that their ultimate plan was to bite off this Kursk bulge, destroy as many Soviet forces in it, and possibly reach the Dnieper River, the Don River at Voronezh. Now, I want to add one aside here. If you look at German strategic planning, Operation Barbarossa, Operation Blau, or this Operation Citadella, you will find one screeching, screaming weakness. And that weakness is an inability to define a strategic end. The Germans were exquisite tacticians. They were unmatched tacticians to war's end. But normally it was irrelevant because they didn't know how to fit the tactics into operational leaps and, most importantly, into a strategic goal. There was, in essence, no strategic goal for this operation. If you get to Voronezh, so what? Where do you go? You obviously don't go any further, or you put yourself in the same situation you were in the previous 2 years. So what advantage is there to being at Voronezh on the can you turn north? Can you turn south? Not if you lay out, as I will for you, the Soviet forces that now are arrayed along this front. When you boil it all down, basically this is an operation decided to destroy as much Soviet materiel, equipment, and as manpower as possible to slow what the Germans knew was coming, and that was new Soviet offensives heading west. That is the goal of Operation Citadella. Now I'm going to show you, we have all the maps. Let's show you first, this is an operation that was supposed to kick off prior to Citadella, just to the south. They never managed to launch this one because they were so intent on raising forces necessary to do the main operation.